attention. With so much at stake,
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
you navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
and around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is modern love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hi, welcome. How many people, this is your first time here? Okay. Have any of you others come to our other environmental series? A few of you. Great. Thank you. This is our fourth in Stepping Up, Business in the Era of Climate Change, a partnership with Boston Questrom Business School and Harvard Business School, who have been great partners. And tonight we're going to talk about transportation. My name's Amy McDonald. I just want to urge you to go to our website, wbur.org/cityspace. I like to call this the 92nd Street Y of Boston. We're doing so many programming. I keep on telling everyone it's killing me. But we've been open 2 months. We've done about 70 events. But it's an array of content. It's not just policy discussions and author interviews and lectures. It's music, it's dance, it's cooking, it's live podcasts. We've had a coffee house opera. We had Margaret Atwood on Saturday. So it's really, really wonderful and exciting. We haven't had a dud yet. We will, but we have not had a dud yet. Every evening has been fantastic. I'd like to introduce Michael Toffel from Harvard Business School, who's going to introduce tonight's panel.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out. Let me just give you a brief sketch of the panelists this evening. So first we have Chris Dempsey, who is a tri-sector alumnus. He's worked both in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's currently in Brookline as the chair of the Brookline Transportation Board. For the state, he was the former Assistant Secretary of Transportation for Massachusetts. And currently, he's the director of a coalition called Transportation for Massachusetts, which advocates better transportation options, increased investment, smarter transportation. He was named Bostonian of the Year in 2015 by the Boston Globe magazine for his role co-chairing the No Boston Olympics movement. And is I'm proud to say is an HBS MBA alumnus as well. Nicole Freeman is here as well. She is the Director of Transportation Planning for the City of Newton, where she's spearheading new initiatives on EV charging and car sharing, electric bike sharing, other innovations there. Before that, she was the Director of Bicycle Programs for the City of Boston, and also the Chief of Active Transportation for Seattle. She also has been a professional bike racer, and she represented the U.S. in the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. Something for everyone here. Adam Gromas is Uber's global lead on sustainability and environmental impact on the policy and communications team. He's also worked for CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and for the California Fuel Cell Partnership. In those roles, he was working on zero-emission vehicle technologies. And our host, our moderator, is Bruce Gellerman. Many of you know his voice on this station as a senior reporter and award-winning journalist with WBUR, where he covers science, business, technology, and the environment. So thanks again very much for joining me, and let me invite the panelists to the stage.
Okay.
Adam, you're here. Bruce, you're here. And Bruce, you may want to mention slido.com, or do you want me
You do it.
Our Q&A tonight, if you go to your phone and just type in slido.com, it will come up and you will see to enter a password. And the password for tonight is SU507. It's a very straightforward, simple way of just asking questions during the conversation, and then we'll throw them to Bruce and we'll see them on the screen. If you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to bring a mic to you as well.
So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I want to show you a familiar picture. You might recognize this. Okay, it kind of says everything. So it turns out that in January, there was a study done, or February, it said that Greater Boston has the worst rush hour traffic in the nation out of 60 metropolitan areas. And it's costing almost $2,300 a year and wasted 164 hours per person. So that's the consequence of, and what we're talking about tonight, I think we'll be talking about planes, trains, and automobiles as well. But so let me ask you how you got here. I know the answers. You did not take Uber Air, but you took an airplane.
I did indeed.
Right? And how did you get here? You don't have a car.
Well, some of us had an appointment across the river, so we ended up taking an Uber together.
Grouped together, four of us, I think.
Yeah, so relatively efficient. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm usually a Green Line rider, or I take a blue bike from Brookline Village to downtown Boston.
Did you ever long for a car? You don't own a car.
I've never owned a car in my life. I don't have any desire to. Would love to keep that going, and that may change someday if I have kids. But I think there's a real freedom in living in a city and not owning a car. It allows you to think about a whole other set of ways to get around, and relieves you of the responsibility of questions like, what's my insurance payment going to be? Did I leave my car on the right side of the road or the left side of the road for street cleaning? Do I have to shovel it out for snow? So
you don't have to maintain it. You don't have to pay insurance. You don't have to.
I love having none of that on my mind.
Do you have a car?
I do. I had the world's oldest Honda Civic up until a year ago. It was in 1990, and people joke that I would still have that car when cars are flying. But now I have a Prius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my Prius just got torn apart, actually. Yeah. It was totaled.
Yeah, and to Chris's point, I'm going away Wednesday through Monday, and I'm so stressed. I'm like, oh my gosh, Friday and Monday are the street cleaning days. What am I going to do?
And do you own a car, or do you always take Uber?
My wife and I do have a car. It mostly sits during the week. We are fortunate enough to live in San Francisco, so I walk or bus to work. And on the weekend, we may need the car to, say, do an errand or head out to the mountains to go for a hike.
Did you get a discount on Uber?
Employees do get a small discount on Uber.
I meant to ask you, you come from an interesting background because you were in the kind of a commercial side. You were working for Goldman Sachs, right? And you were doing strategic investing, social investing?
Impact investing, they call it. There's lots of terminology in that field, but it's the idea that you can align your portfolio with your values and make investments that are strategically into organizations, companies that are building things that are good for the world and affecting change in the way that you think they ought to be affecting that change. And in fact, Goldman had bought the small boutique investment firm I was working for, Imprint Capital, and we specialize in impact investing, and Goldman had made a purchase and acquisition, and then I became a Goldman Sachs employee, which was many of my colleagues from business school used to make fun of me for that, because I was the last guy in the business school class they ever expected to be at Goldman Sachs, being the crunchy California environmentalist at our school. But that's how the story went.
Mm-hmm. And is Uber, do you think, a social impacting company?
It's interesting. When I got there, almost everybody I talked to, from engineering to people that worked in operations or in marketing, had told me that the reason why they joined was for mission-based reasons or values-aligned reasons. Some people said they were interested in giving people the opportunity for flexible work. Others said they were interested in efficiency in transportation. There was all kinds of reasons, and many of them were values-based or mission-based judgment. From my perspective, when I was living in Brooklyn, actually, when Uber launched, and at first I thought, this is a terrible idea. Yellow cab works great. I mostly take the subway. I didn't really get it. And then it was years later when I was actually at Goldman and doing some research into the transportation sector and looking at ways in which we might make serious impact into the transportation sector, because if anybody's looking at the scoreboard, transportation is contributing about a quarter of the world's carbon emissions.
Here in Massachusetts, I think it's 40%.
It's 40% in Massachusetts. In California, it's 50%. In the United States, it's the largest net contributor. Transportation is the sector that we should be focused on if you care about climate. And so as I was looking at what are the ideas for how we're going to get there with transportation, some academics and banks and consultants, everybody was talking about shared electric automated mobility technologies. And I looked at that and I thought, well, boy, maybe I missed something with these guys at Uber and Lyft and some of the other ride-hailing companies. So I looked into it some more, and lo and behold, here I sit.
So the three magic words: shared, mobility, and electric. Can we all agree, or maybe I'm wrong, is the future electric of transportation, and is the future of transportation really mobility? I mean, I don't use the words interchangeably. I look at mobility as a service in a sense. Maybe I'm wrong, but would you agree that the future, Nicole, that the future is electric in terms of transportation?
I'm close to sure, yes. You can see it going very strongly that way now. If you look at a chart of electric vehicle purchases, year over year, it's an exponential curve. I
mean, you ride bikes. Are you ever going to? Do you have an electric bike?
I do not. I wanted one this morning, however, when I was biking up the hill. I have a standard bike. Mm-hmm. So yes, absolutely electric, absolutely autonomous, which was your second bullet. And the third bullet, shared, I think that's the one where in transportation people talk about the heaven or hell scenario, which is as a society we might see autonomous and electric vehicles creating a situation where you take a vehicle to work, parking is really expensive, so that the vehicle then drives all the way back home, comes get you again and does all your shopping, and it's just driving with nobody in it all day. So that's sort of the hell scenario. Everyone has their autonomous vehicle. The flip side is all of the autonomous vehicles are shared. People no longer own cars. There's no need for parking, and total vehicle miles traveled goes down. What separates the heaven from the hell is really, it's political, it's in political will, but as cities, as states, and as federal government, what policies do we put in place to steer the future in the direction we know is best for the climate?
Which path do you think we're on, Nicole?
Right now, we're in the wrong path. We are.
Meaning that we're all going to own our own vehicles, continuously own it. They'll drive from here to there when we use them. We won't be using them 95%, 99% of the time.
Yeah, the thing that is promising is, I think, all of transportation is really happening at the city level. All of the policy and sort of the positive things that we will see will come out of cities. They're the leaders. The cities really realize that they were behind the eight ball with Uber and Lyft in terms of setting policies that are good for cities. So we have a situation right now where Uber and Lyft is creating more trips and taking people away from public transportation instead of doing what it has the potential to do, which is actually take people out of personal cars, get people to own personal cars less, and decrease total vehicle miles traveled. The good thing is, I think city officials and elected officials realized that we were behind the eight ball, and I think they're trying to make up for it and hopefully going in the right direction and trying to get ahead of the game on autonomous and trying to get ahead of the game on electric and shared, and hopefully will sort of change courses.
So electric is the future. Is that a premise we can make?
Yeah, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody working on climate and transportation that doesn't agree that electrification is a primary pillar of helping transportation reach the climate impact goals it needs to as a sector in order to stay within the 1.5 degrees to 2 degree scenario.
But, in New York City, they have, if you're going to have a cab, I think this is true, you have to have a hybrid cab. Why doesn't Uber require its cars to be electric? Wouldn't that be, then we wouldn't have a government mandate.
The problem would just go away. Yeah, it's an interesting proposal, Bruce, and we've looked at this in a number of different ways. We have about 24 or so electric vehicle initiatives in as many cities around the world. I think the first thing that we do when we look at providing this service is our first customer is the driver. And when you look across the American landscape, EV penetration is somewhere around 1% or so of sales or less. States like Massachusetts have done a great job, actually. You're probably at much higher levels at this point. And Massachusetts is also...
about 3%, I think?
We're still well below California.
Yeah.
So per capita, California sells something like 4 or 5 electric vehicles for every one that we sell.
Got it. Well, in Massachusetts, along with 8 other states, have adopted California-style rules in terms of automotive emissions, which is a very good thing and good for this country. But that's an exception, generally speaking, looking across the American landscape. So from that perspective, there'd be very few people who would be able to access that. And by and large, people who like to drive on Uber a lot often don't have the means to afford an EV, which still faces a price premium in the market. Even hybrids today, the Prius that you mentioned you drive, Bruce, or that you drive, Nicole, often comes at a premium versus, say, a used non-hybrid vehicle, which often is a preferred vehicle of choice. That said, we're seeing positive results. For instance, we looked at some data from 2017, and we found that drivers in California on our platform were using hybrids for more than 22% of all the passenger miles. I thought I thought, is that a lot? Is that not a lot? And then I looked at hybrid sales in California, and I was shocked to see this because I live in San Francisco and I probably see a disproportionate share of hybrids. But hybrid sales in California are only around 4 to 5% of sales for the last 8 years or so. So that was good. Uber drivers adopting hybrids at somewhere around 4 to 5 times the consumer average. That's good. EVs, we have more barriers to address, and happy to get into that later. But it's a challenge, and we think about it first and foremost from the perspective of the driver's economics, their personal economics.
Nicole, you say?
Well, I was going to say, as cities, if we put in high speed chargers in our downtown areas, all of a sudden the calculus changes for Uber and Lyft drivers. And it's interesting, in cities oftentimes in the state, we're thinking about what should we do for chargers, and we're thinking about slower chargers, and we talk about how people have their garages, and we're really focused on getting people to purchase personal vehicles to make that choice electric. But I would much rather have an Uber driver or a Lyft driver get an electric vehicle than an individual, because they drive those probably 10 times as many miles as the average person. So I think our role is, let's get some fast chargers in our cities, so that when that Uber or Lyft driver is looking at which car to lease, there is no opportunity cost of searching for a charger and sitting there waiting for it to charge. All of a sudden, it's all upside for them. They can drive no cost, really in time to charge that vehicle and get back on the street. There's no Uber or Lyft driver that wouldn't want to do that.
And it's a really exciting vision for electrification too, because it takes away one of the key challenges of driving EV adoption in the US and in our car ownership model of getting around, which is you have to convince people to buy an EV.
Right.
And so far, that has been a tough proposal. I used to work for the California Air Resources Board 20 years ago when we were trying it in the early 2000s, and it's been a slow go since then. So maybe if we switch that from saying, would you buy just an electric trip? That may be an easier sell than buying an EV.
That's why I say not buy a car, but buy mobility.
Right.
So your Toyota or General Motors, instead of selling you a car, they'd be cars wherever you wanted, and you'd get your phone or whatever mechanism you had to have it dispatched to you.
I think that's the vision, but we've got a lot of work to do to make that world a reality. Today, all of the policy landscape, the incentive landscape, not only for EVs, but for fossil-fueled cars, is designed for personal use. Streets are designed, curbs are largely designed for personal use. They imagine a world where we all own a car and drive it ourselves. And so far, the data would show that is how we get around. 92% of all miles in the United States, passenger miles, are done in private cars.
But it's interesting because that street right outside is our future for the next 80 years at least, right? And it's just being installed right now. So the vision of its future was locked in 20 years ago, 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. You may probably know Nicole better than I. But if you look at it, it's kind of a weird street, right? In the center, you have a subway, which is not really a subway, it's above ground. So it's kind of this trolley thing. And then you have buses, which can go there. And on the other side, they're just putting in the bike lane. And then there's the pedestrian sidewalks. But the pedestrian sidewalks were designed not for this disruptive technology which just happened last year, which were the electric scooters. Right? So how do you build an infrastructure for the future when it's changing literally under your feet?
I mean, the challenge you have on a road like Copenhagen, I lived this. This was my very last project in the city of Boston.
Oh, is that right?
When I left in 2015. You know, your challenge is, your constraint is the buildings are in place and you have the right of way. So you've got a certain width that you can work with. But when you say that's locked in, there's still much more that can be done given where the right of way is. Number one, you can put in transit signal priority so that the T never stops. Never stops at a red light.
Seemingly sometimes never goes.
Yeah. Number two, you've got 2 travel lanes in each direction. You can turn one into a bus priority lane with no cars in it. So all of a sudden the buses have priority. In terms of scooters, they can use the protected bike lane that's going in right now. And then you do have the sidewalk as it is. I don't know what the solution is for Uber and Lyft trips, but probably what you would have to do is create separate pickup drop-off zones so that you're not constantly stopping in the middle of the road causing congestion when you're down to 1 lane with your bus priority lane.
Right. But I think Uber's involved in these electric scooters now, are you?
We, last year, we made an acquisition of a company called Jump. And at the time, they were into e-bikes and shared bike services. And they just started getting into e-scooters. And, you know, this as a model street, which, you know, big congratulations, Nicole, for the city in putting this forward. These are hard fought, these types of streets, but they're beautiful and they'll be better suited for a shared use mobility system that includes micro-mobility options like scooters and bikes, because there's space for them. There's space for them to exist. A protected bike lane is a very wonderful thing, but it's a rare sight on American streets, unfortunately, but for some cities leading by example.
Yeah. So every bike advocate in the city deserves, I think, 99.9% of the credit for that protected bike lane, because it was not scheduled to have a protected bike lane. It was the 11th hour. And the advocates got right in there and said, if you build it the way this is, it will be outdated. I mean, it would have been outdated in 2015. It would have been so outdated today, it would be an embarrassment to all of us. And the city did the right thing, and the state, and updated that plan as they should have. You know, and even now I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, in 10 years we're going to need the protected bike lane to be twice as wide. You know, so inevitably you do your best. That it's so hard to future-proof for 30, 40, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Chris, were you on the governor's Transportation of the Future Task Force? Were you on that?
I was not, but we followed it very closely. Had a number of conversations with
because the reason, so this happened last year, right?
Yep.
And we had a big report, and they had a lot of very heavy-duty people, extraordinary study from a lot of different angles. And one of the things that the governor said, and the report said, was actually 2 things. It is about transportation, but it's really about us, where we live, and how we use transportation. The fact that we're getting older, I know I am, but it's that we're having more senior populations there, but it's also housing, and what do we do in these urban areas, and what do we do with people who don't live in urban areas, and we're providing transportation to them. How do we design it? So housing, let's just take a look at the housing side of that. I mean, you live in San Francisco, and you live in Boston, right?
Brookline, yep.
And Brookline, essentially Boston, which is a genius. Well, Brookline was genius because it created an urban center, a suburban center with urban transportation. And it's used all the time. it works. What do we need going forward if there's one thing? How do we please this growing older population, this growing urban population? What do we do, Chris?
So, Bruce, I don't think there's one thing that we can do to fix our transportation issues, and especially to fix our transportation and housing issues, which are very much intertwined. But I do think that the image you showed of cars jammed on the Tobin Bridge is very much representative of where we are today, which is completely stuck, not just physically stuck on roads, but sort of metaphorically stuck in our transportation thinking. And we need to move to new policies that force us to realize that that system is not working and that we need to make different trade-offs. And I think one of the key tools there that Transportation for Massachusetts talks about a lot, and that I know Nicole shares as an idea and Uber also shares in their support of, is to do some form of pricing of our roads. You'll hear it called congestion pricing, you'll hear it called variable tolling or smarter tolling, but essentially what it means is to ask people to think about the cost that they are imposing when they get on a congested road at a congested time of day. When you're that driver in that vehicle, you think you're already paying a really high price because you're stuck there with your, in your car, not being where you want to be, not moving as quickly as you want to. But in many ways, the cost that you're paying is actually not the full cost that you're imposing on society. Partly because you're creating a whole bunch of emissions that people that live around that road are breathing in and that are warming our climate, but also because the very fact that you got on that road at a congested time of day means that every other driver around you is getting to their destination a little bit more slowly. So when we talk about congestion, we talk about it as a nonlinear function in which every car that gets added to a congested road creates more congestion than the car that came before it. And that's a really bad dynamic. It's how we go from kind of an open road to a totally gridlocked road. The only silver lining to that dynamic is that when we get a relatively small number of cars off the road at rush hour, we have a relatively big impact on congestion reduction. The rule of thumb there is that if you can get 5% of cars off the road at rush hour, you get a 20% reduction in traffic. Think about it like driving into the city on a Friday morning in the summer. Sometimes that trip can feel so much more open and so much faster. It's not that 50% of people went on vacation, it's that 5% did, but the road feels open. And so if we had, for example, a toll on the Tobin Bridge, all those cars that are driving over the Tobin are already paying one, but if we had a toll that was a little bit higher at rush hour and a little bit lower outside of rush hour, we might be able to get 5% of cars to switch their trip, or a few percentage points of drivers to decide to take a bus instead of taking a car, or take a train instead of taking a car. And if we manage that road capacity better, we actually end up with a system that works better for everyone, especially the people that need to drive to work. Because today we are forcing them to sit in traffic, and in a world where we better manage and price that road, they get to work a heck of a lot faster.
Well, I can think about 100 different things that are wrong with that.
Throw them at me, Bruce.
You played it from a social equity, right? It's fair. Yeah. But it's not fair because the people that are going to take advantage of the discounted times are going to be people who can not afford it at the more expensive times.
So that's the number one question that we get on this policy is that fair? And I want to go back to the Tobin Bridge and that image that you saw. One of the bus routes that goes over the Tobin Bridge is the 111 bus. It's the third busiest bus in the MBTA system. It carries more than 12,000 riders per day. It starts in Revere, it picks up most of its passengers in Chelsea, and it drops them off at Haymarket in downtown Boston. These are blue-collar workers. Many of them are hourly wage workers. These are the folks that clean offices in downtown Boston, that work in the restaurants of downtown Boston. And they take the bus. That's how they get to work from Chelsea. That bus ride is about 2.7 miles from downtown Chelsea to downtown Boston. And it will regularly take that bus 45 minutes to go 2.7 miles. That's an average speed of less than 4 miles an hour. So you could easily walk or bike, and especially if you're Nicole on a bike, you could very quickly bike that much faster than what the bus can do. But we long ago made it illegal to walk or bike over the Tobin Bridge. And so we force these blue-collar workers to be stuck, packed in like sardines on those buses. Those buses, by the way, they leave every 4 minutes at rush hour. So this is not a problem of the MBTA not providing sufficient bus service. This is a problem of the congestion on the Tobin Bridge. And if you look at the demographics, frankly, of who is creating that congestion on the Tobin Bridge, it is much more likely to be someone who's white, from a suburb, is a white-collar worker, and has their parking spot paid for them by their company in downtown Boston. So tell me about the equity and the fairness of the status quo. Is that a fair situation today? I'm not going to claim that putting a peak price on the Tobin Bridge is going to instantly make our society a completely fair place. But I would argue that it will make it a lot fairer than the system that we have today.
What about making it free? Make the bus free.
So if you put a peak toll on the Tobin Bridge,
free to the user.
If you put a peak toll on the Tobin Bridge, you could easily pay for the operating cost of the 111 and totally eliminate the fare on the 111 and probably also on some of the commuter rail lines from the North Shore. That is how much value is locked up. And today, as a society, we are burning that value in people's time and literally in gasoline, in emissions. And tomorrow, we could capture that value and we could invest it in much more efficient ways to move around. It's actually very similar to what we've been doing on the electricity side, where rather than just saying, hey, we're going to build yet another power plant and yet another power plant and more coal and more natural gas, instead what we've said is, let's essentially increase some electricity rates and then give people rebates and incentives to use less energy. If anyone in this room has ever heard of or used the Mass Save program, which gives you a rebate for a more efficient house, that's essentially the same thing as what we're proposing in transportation. Let's make it more efficient by using these economic incentives.
I think it's incredibly enlightened, Bruce. I would vote for him.
Right? Right? Maybe he should be in government.
Look, I mean, we the rest of the United States rely on the Commonwealth to come up with ideas like this, where we have these disaster of the commons problems, and I think road pricing is really enlightened. And to Chris's point, when you raise those revenues from the road pricing, you put them back into the public transit system and look at other ways to support the natural regressiveness of those types of programs. It's a very good thing. It's not just hypothetical what he's talking about. We have examples to look at for our peer cities across the seas. London has done this for a while, about 10 years. Singapore has done it. We were just talking in the car for almost 50 years. Stockholm, Milan, there's a couple examples, and they're doing what Chris is proposing. And we can look to them. What did they experience?
What if we just did it for Uber and Lyft and the ride-sharing programs?
The challenge that you'd run into, and this has been proposed by a number of cities, Chicago, DC, Boston, Seattle, and others have proposed, let's just put a tax just on the ride-share segment. I think the challenge whenever you price one particular user of the road more than others is that consumers are smart and they do the thing that is cheapest, and that is to drive themselves. Mostly people drive themselves. To Chris's point, roads are free to be used, and usually owning and operating your own fossil-fueled car is the cheapest thing to do. It's why 92% of all miles in the United States are driven in a personal car. If you zoom into the city level, it's around 86% of all miles, and even in cities like Boston, which have a substantial share of their travel done by transit, you're still well below half of all trips are served by transit. And you got most people driving, and they do it because we all act rationally. We do what makes sense for us. And so I think the challenge you'd run into is that consumers would say, oh, well, it's expensive to share. It's much easier to just take my own car.
Right. Can I ask a question? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I argue with you that I don't believe it's the cheapest thing to do. I mean, I gave up my car years ago. I do fine. I can't believe that the times I take the T, the times I take Uber, or the times I take a Zipcar is much less expensive than what it costs me to own and operate a car. So you're off on your statement, I believe.
Yeah,
I don't disagree with you, by the way, that there's a lot of people that take the car because it's more convenient, but I don't think it's necessarily cheaper.
So I think you're right. I think what Adam is getting at, though, is on any individual trip, it might be cheaper to take a car. And part of our challenge is that we often get locked in with our costs for a car, right? So you're paying your upfront cost, and then you're paying your monthly payment on your car, and then maybe even your parking. And because that's all built into your costs, the individual trip is actually really cheap to you. When places have actually started to try to change those incentives, they've gotten very different outcomes. So MIT is a good example of this. They used to have just a monthly parking fee for their staff and their faculty. And what they've said is, we're no longer going to offer that. We're going to charge you on a day-to-day basis. And the day they moved to that policy, they saw the demand for their parking garage decrease. Because when the weather was nice, when it made sense for people to take transit, they were doing that instead because they were confronted with that marginal cost rather than the fixed cost.
And it's time
so your point is very much right, sir, but it fits into kind of a broader ecosystem of transportation options.
And time value too matters because the convenience often in most cities, Boston's an exception to some of these talking points, but the time value matters a lot, and the car is generally the most convenient way to get around most American cities. And it's true for most of the cities in Europe as well. Like I said, 92% of all the passenger miles traveled in the United States are served in personally owned vehicles. Transit has about 3%, according to the last DOT survey. 3% of all travel in the United States is served by transit. It's a very, very small share. Transit used to have close to 100%. Back about 120 years ago, before the automobile was introduced. Used to serve most trips. And then when the automobile was made available and affordable to consumers, that flipped.
So you lived in Washington State, right? Yes. Next door was Oregon, and they were debating, and I think they still are considering having tolling mileage for every car. Right? Basically, at the end of I'm not sure the mechanism, you would actually have to pay a fee for the amount of miles.
They call it vehicle miles traveled, the VMT.
Has it passed?
I don't know that, but I would say you asked the question of what can we do, what can we do? And Chris said congestion charging or tolling, and I would sort of add to it, pricing is the sort of umbrella of everything we need to do. We need to price driving according to price driving appropriately and really internalize all of the negative externalities of driving. So in addition to the congestion charge or the tolling, number two is, I always say, dramatically increase the cost per mile that people drive. Right now we have a mechanism called the gas tax. It's to be priced correctly, it would be increased very significantly. And over time, we really want to switch from a gas tax to a vehicle mile traveled tax, because as we have more and more electric vehicles, our source of revenue is off a little bit. But then you do number three is you charge market rate for parking. Right now you go downtown, it can be $1, $2 to park your car per hour, or you can go into a garage and pay $50 per day. So we know what the real market rate is for parking, so we need to charge that much, and I guarantee you if we charge that much in our meters, again, you'd see that many less people driving. And lastly,
go ahead, sorry.
Lastly, removing lots of parking.
What's that?
Lastly, you want to remove a lot of the parking we have in our
And
cities.
we're doing that in Boston.
Yes.
Which is interesting, and maybe, Chris, you know the statistic here, I don't know in San Francisco, but most traveling in the city is not to get from point A to point B, but to find parking. People circulate. And is that true?
Well,
I don't know if it's most, but it's...
there's lots of theories, and the statistic that everyone cites of 30% of all drivers or 60% of all drivers are circling for parking at any one time in a downtown, it's actually taken out of context. But what we do know is a significant number of people driving or circling for parking. And one way to tell what that demand is pull out of a spot and see how quickly someone moves into your spot. If it happens instantaneously, you know there's a lot of people circling.
Sorry, you were going to ask a question, somebody?
All this pricing, of course, it makes sense. But it only makes sense to me if you offer people an option, an alternative. I mean, increasing prices when there is no alternative is really unfair. It's wrong because all you will accomplish is that people will pay more, but they still don't have an option. Look at all the people on Mass Pike who are coming from the suburbs to work in Boston. What are they supposed to do?
So it's a great question, and it's tied to this question of, is this fair? You're just asking people to pay more. There's a couple of ways to answer that question. So the first is remember we talked about the 111 bus, which is a pretty miserable experience today. It is miserable, and I've ridden this bus, to be packed in like sardines, standing up, surrounded by people that are all just trying to get to work like you, and you're going at less than 4 miles an hour. That is not a very attractive option.
But I'm not talking about Chelsea. I'm talking about people in Framingham.
Sure, okay, but this is representative of that. So it's not a very attractive option. But in a world where we have significantly reduced congestion, then all of a sudden that bus is moving more quickly. It's actually less crowded because it can cover more miles, and it's a faster trip. And the same would be true of the Pike. So today on the Pike, you already have the Worcester-Framingham line, which already mostly parallels the Pike. You also have express buses run by the MBTA and by private providers like Peter Pan that are going in and out of South Station and other stops. But again, those are a pretty miserable experience at rush hour because you're stuck in traffic. The day you put congestion pricing in place is also the day you dramatically improve the experience of your bus system. When they put this in place in London, congestion pricing in London in 2003, they knew that this system was coming in place and they knew it was going to generate revenue. And so they bonded on the revenue. And they went out and they bought 300 additional buses to provide more service on existing bus lines and to run new bus lines. And because of that, they were instantly giving people more options. And the day they put congestion pricing in place, traffic in central London dropped 30%. That's the kind of transformational impact that we can have. Now again, this doesn't need to be true for everybody. We're not trying to get every single person out of their car, just some people, trying to give them that little nudge by making them think about the price, but then by also offering them better options at the same time.
So why aren't we doing it?
Well, this is the question to you. Is Uber part of the solution, part of the pollution? What do we know about freeing up cars? Does it help? Does it hurt?
From our standpoint, we're big supporters of road pricing and the schemes that both Nicole and Chris are talking about. I think that creates a system by which all the actors in that system need to compete for efficiency. And from our perspective as a technology provider to the transportation sector, we would love to compete for efficiency. We believe our technology adds efficiency to the existing way of getting around. Let me illustrate that point. So today, there's about 1.2 billion cars in the world. And in the private world of mobility, they're used about 4% of the time. And they generally have 4 to 5 seats in them. And when people are driving them, that 4% of the time or so, there's about 1 or 2 people in them. That means, if you just run that math through, there's about 100 million to 200 million empty seats moving around the world at any given time. So Uber's insight from the highest level a couple years ago was, what if you could push a button and get one of those seats going the direction you are? Now, of course, as we launch the service in cities, a lot of the people that use our service are already the sort of urban savvy. They're the types like Chris who don't own a car already. They're using lots of options. This is filling in gaps. Maybe they're using it at times when they can't catch a cab or can't take the bus. Maybe they're using it at the same time that the bus is serving, but the bus line was broke down that day. And so in the early days here, the early adopters tend to be those urban savvy types. But over the long run, what we hope is that as we create a platform for mobility, back to the point you were making earlier, mobility as a service, when we make it easier to make the choice to leave the car at home and have an option. I'm going to go from A to B. What's the best way I can go from A to B? That day it might be taking a bike. And through a service like Uber Jump, we hope at the push of a button to grab a bike, an electric bike if there's
What does that say that again?
Jump. Jump is a company that we bought last year. They operate bike share and scooter share services in cities. So on the Uber app in cities where Jump is available, in about a dozen cities in the US and in Berlin, and now in Paris, I believe. If you open up your Uber app, in addition to taking a car ride, you can take a bike ride or a scooter ride in cities where that's available. If you're in Cairo or in Kiev, you can open up the app and see that there's a Uber bus that might be available, and that might be a van or a larger format vehicle, 8 to 12 seater type vehicle, to provide a commuter option coming in from out of town. And we just launched in Denver Uber Transit. And so Uber Transit allows you to do way planning, so you can link to transit from your Uber ride. In Denver today, you can now buy a ticket on the local mass transit system. And in London, we opened up a wayfinding mechanism so you can see the route times for the tube and other things like that in the Uber app. So from our standpoint, if we can make it more convenient for the consumer to say, I'm just going from A to B, we provide you with the most efficient and convenient options, you can make a much easier choice than figuring out, dude, where's my car? Which side of the street did I leave it on, et cetera.
You know, I have a daughter who goes here to BU, and she lives down the block from a bus station at the dorm, and she could take the bus to Watertown Square, where we live in Watertown, and I would pick her up there. And it's and I'm not asking you to solve my transportation or my daughter problem, but I think this is kind of typical of kids now, of teenagers, and I use Uber and I use Lyft, and I enjoy the experience. I do most of the time. But her thinking is, I'm not taking the bus. Pick me up, or I'll take an Uber home. So instead of $1.65, and I'll pick her up a few blocks there, or just walk, she's really conditioned into it's easy. It's in my pocket. I'll be there in 12 minutes instead of 40 minutes. How do we deal with that? Because we've created a very powerful system. Uber is enormously convenient.
So Seattle's been looking at exactly this, and I think everyone says the technology that Uber and Lyft have is so powerful, and it really has the potential to solve a lot of the problems we have, but it needs to be used correctly. So in Seattle, they're noticing too this uptick in vehicle miles traveled or vehicle trips due to Ubers and Lyfts, but they're looking at things such as a very high tax at peak hours, so that you might be less inclined to use Uber and Lyft at those hours. Looking at potential taxes for zombie trips, trips when you have no passengers. I guess technically that's not a zombie. And lastly, you can have two different rates for taxes. One tax for when there's a single passenger only, and a much lower tax if you have two or more passengers. And that type of policies really will sort of shift sort of the outcome of what we're seeing with Uber and Lyft, and really let us harness many of the positives of Uber and Lyft instead of seeing this uptick in vehicle miles traveled. I mean, the thing that's great and maybe even a little misleading about this uptick in vehicle miles traveled is, if Uber and Lyft is encouraging people to get rid of their personal vehicles because it has filled that gap. So before they were biking, or they wanted to bike, or they wanted to get rid of their car, but there were just too many trips that they needed a car. If it's really helping people get rid of that car, it is doing a great service. We just need to sort of push it along in this direction a little bit more and a little quicker.
So Bruce, the dynamic you're getting at is very real, and it's happening. We see it at Logan Airport, and this is an example where Uber and I were on different sides of this issue. But when your daughter gets in an Uber or Lyft, she's making the most convenient choice for herself to go out and visit you in Watertown. And I don't want to take that away from her at all. That's her right to do that. The problem is the most convenient trip for her is the least convenient trip for everyone else except for her, because she's creating more congestion and more emissions while she makes that trip instead of taking the 57 bus. And so we believe that it's the role of government, which ultimately owns these streets, to better balance those incentives, not to take that option away from your daughter, but just to make her think about it a little bit more. And so maybe it is a rainy day and she's tired and she just wants to go home to your home cooking, Bruce.
Not mine.
As fast as she can. And she's willing to pay the $8 to take the Uber. But maybe most days, or the day when it's nicer and she's not as happy to see you because she's mad at you for some reason, she's like, I'm taking the 57 bus today instead. And it's about shaping that choice. It's kind of a choice architecture that ultimately the public sector is responsible for. We can't just make Uber and Lyft the scapegoats for all of our congestion. The congestion exists because the public sector is not doing a good job of managing that street space. And we need to take that responsibility and do better. And we can do better, and we have examples around the country.
One of the things that's happening, it's not just municipalities or states, but here it's regional. And there's a conversation going on about regional greenhouse gas initiative, which we have for electrification for our generation. But they're also now talking about 13 states up and down the East Coast of basically engaging in a fuel charge at the border or the region. And that would be, now the question is so you understand how that would work. Your transportation fuels would be charged, would be extra, be paying for it. But the question then becomes, what about two things? One about people who live in rural areas who have to travel large distances or longer distances. And the other is, what do you do with the money that you collect? Who gets it? Does it get redistributed? How do you make it from being onerous? I mean, we want the transportation, we want the society to move. Yeah. Good idea, bad idea, regional solution, surcharge on gas?
So Bruce, at T4Mass, we're strong supporters of this policy, and we're really glad to have Governor Baker's leadership on it. It's very much a bipartisan issue, so you've got Republican governors like Governor Baker and Governor Hogan in Maryland, Governor Scott in Vermont, and Democratic governors like Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island and Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania that are all starting to acknowledge that this emissions problem is very real and needs to be addressed. But I think we also haven't talked enough about the public health components of this question. To get back to that Tobin Bridge picture, which again, I really think encapsulates a lot of our challenges in Massachusetts, Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is home to the Tobin Bridge and Route 1 as it crosses the Mystic River, has the highest rates of asthma hospitalization of any municipality in Massachusetts. And it's no coincidence that it has Logan Airport on one side, the Tobin Bridge on the other, and one of the largest food and fruit distribution centers in the United States, square in the middle. Those are transportation emissions that the citizens and residents and children of Chelsea are breathing in, and that is directly impacting their public health. And this is yet another reason why we should acknowledge that the status quo is really unfair. Now, if we went to a system like Reggie for transportation, so again, we already have this on the electricity side and we want to bring it to transportation, there are real questions about folks that live in rural areas that don't have the option of taking the Green Line or the commuter rail from the Worcester or Framingham line. In those cases, you can do two things. One is you can literally just give them a rebate and you can say, here's a check that you and your family are going to receive every year to make up for any increased fuel costs as part of this program. And that
money would come from the fuel charge.
Correct. So you can do that. Or you can say, as we do on the electricity side, we are going to give you rebates and incentives to get a cleaner vehicle. And so you can drive just as many miles as you're driving today, or even more miles, frankly, and have your household pay less because your car is more efficient. And that improvement would be paid for by this same program. And it's this, again, the same thing we do on the electricity side with the Mass Save program. So there are good options that we have, good tools that we have as policymakers and advocates to make sure that this will make our state more fair at the same time that it's cleaning up our air.
These are thoughtful policies because it just like the road pricing example where we talked about before, that's kind of like creating a VMT budget for everybody to live on. And in this case, it's a carbon budget. California has been operating a similar policy to what the 13-state proposal is, which is called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and it creates a cap and trade program within the state. And the key, just like what Chris was mentioning, is for government to be internalizing those externalities, redistributing the funds to support low-income folks that would otherwise be disproportionately hurt, and investment in options, new options, cleaner options. Those are the two key pillars from where I sit for programs like that.
How do we get people to ride bicycles more? I've been to Copenhagen. I've been to, it's amazing. I mean, you have
highways. What do you think the secret is, Bruce?
What? I don't know. It's social mentality. Is it sociological? Is it physical?
Might be tulips. It's just prettier.
Is it prettier? Well, they have tulips in Washington State. I don't
Nicole is the expert on this.
I mean, it's faster, cheaper, healthier.
Yeah. So everyone says Copenhagen. They have 33% of all their ships, I believe, are made by bicycle, and everyone says, well, we can't do that. We're not Copenhagen. And actually, the answer is we kind of are, because 40 years ago, Copenhagen was just like Boston. It was, a lot of cars and a lot of congestion, and they even have snow. So what they did is they saw the gas crisis of the 70s, and they made a decision. They said, we are going to invest in bicycle infrastructure. And they created a network of protected bike lanes, lanes where you are on a bike and you are physically separated from moving vehicles by more than a white line. Protected bike lanes like the one you'll see out here on Commonwealth Avenue. And it worked, and it continues to work. But make no mistake, every single project that they do, they still have a public process, and there's still people opposing it. So Copenhagen really is just like Boston. Boston is like them. Portland, Oregon, they have 8% mode share right now, and they are in the US the best bicycle city, and same formula. They invested in bicycle infrastructure, and they're really moving towards that separation from the cars, from the bikes. And so if you do a poll, and people have done this all over in the United States, almost 50% of the population wants to bike. The number one reason they don't bike is safety. They're afraid of cars. They're afraid for their safety. And so when you put, if you have a city that has no bicycle infrastructure whatsoever, you have about 1% of the population willing to bike. They're the strong and the fearless. People like, I don't know, me. And then if you put in a white line of paint, you can get up to about 7% of the population biking. And those are really, they're called the sort of confident and enthusiastic cyclists. And, but it's not like people like my mom. She bikes in the suburbs regularly, but she'd be terrified to bike here. And she always says, look, I know a truck can go over that white line and hit me. So what you find is you can get up to 30-40% of the population biking when you do these protected bike lanes. And the cities that have done protected bike lanes, the studies that come out, is they're seeing upwards of a 300% increase in ridership overnight when they make these protected bike lanes, when people don't fear for their safety, when they know they're separate from cars. So I think we know how to do it. It's just very, very hard when you're battling for space, when you've got your right-of-way fixed between two buildings, and you have to figure out how are we going to allocate the space between cars, bikes, pedestrians, outdoor cafes, transit, buses, and you're balancing all of these competing interests.
But it's really fascinating to see the flow of bikes in Copenhagen, right? Because during rush hour is a stream of bikes, and then the rush hour the other way, it's a stream bike.
Yes.
They have terrible bike parking problems, right? Horrible. They haven't solved that. I spoke to the head of the Copenhagen Bikers Union. They have such a guy. And I said, he says, what's the difference? He says, well, here we dress for our destination. We don't dress for the journey. I said, so you don't wear Lycra? He says, only in my dreams. Yeah, please.
A couple of things. I noticed in your visions of the future, except for the Hyperloop, which is not going to happen.
It is happening.
All of the...
that may be the only one that does.
How do you turn it on? Oh. All of the options were individual.
What is that?
All of the options, except for the Hyperloop, and your visions of the future were individual pods. There was no mass transit. It was individual transit.
Good.
So that was weird.
Very good.
The second point is, where can you park a bike around here? I had to go way up the street. Where's your bike rack?
I can tell you, actually, because when I worked for Boston Bikes, it was right in front there where the construction is, so I assume it will go back.
Hope you'll put a bigger one in.
There were multiple.
Hang on. I've got a few questions. So Nicole mentioned the very simple option of coordinating the lights on the green line so they're always green for the train. How hard could that be? How come it hasn't happened?
So I have a good answer for you on that one. So I'm a Brookline town meeting member, and the very first article I sponsored was for the town of Brookline to allocate some money for our portion to match with the state to do it on Beacon Street, which is the same situation as here. It's been incredibly slow and frustrating. That was 2012 when I got that budgeted from the town of Brookline. So it's been 7 years. The MBTA has said in their Focus 40 plan, which is their list of prioritization projects, that full green line signalization prioritization will be done by the end of this calendar year. But they have not yet hired the person who's responsible for that project. So when that person starts, he or she is going to have a lot of work on their plate to get it done in the final 6 or 8 months of the year.
There's no shortage of programmers around here, so.
It's a doable thing. It's done elsewhere, and it's frankly just been a frustrating bureaucratic process. So there's no excuse why we don't have it done, why the MBTA doesn't have it done. They need to get it done soon, and thankfully it is at least part of their plan. So if they don't have it done by the end of this year, we have something to hold them to and say, in your own plan, you said you were going to do this. What's the story?
I mean, the final point was what the woman at the very beginning said. We're talking about a lot of sticks, and I think it's really important to talk a lot about the carrots.
Yes.
You know, recently they introduced the bus going from Back Bay Station to the airport. I'm going to give that a try. But we don't have enough carrots, and you've traveled in other cities, and you see how they have great subways, and you wouldn't dream of doing it. I have kids in their 20s, they wouldn't dream of taking the Green Line. They jump on Uber, which right now is part of the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, these are delicious questions you're asking.
Can we focus on air travel?
Please do, because I just came from Chicago this weekend, right? So it took me a total of about 7 hours to get from Chicago to here, and then to my house was like another hour. And I took public transport from Chicago to the airport, from the airport here to my house. But the question is, why did it take 7 hours? If we had high-speed train like I took in Spain, it would have been 4 hours. Same speed, same distance, 1,000 kilometers, 1,000 miles, 1,300 kilometers. What?
I'm not an expert on high-speed rail, but as a Californian, we've had high-speed rail legislation and funding since the 1970s. We have no trains to show for it so far. I once worked for a guy when I worked at the NYU Wagner Rudin Center for Transportation, which is a think tank for transportation at NYU. And he said that one of the challenges is the local democracy of the American way of life. We like local control. And so in a state like California, when you're trying to lay track, the government's got to buy land. And when you buy land, you go to the individual townships that say, well, it should go here, or it should go here, or it should go here. And all of a sudden, your track becomes like this. And now your train speeds are like 50 miles an hour, and it's not very fast anymore. And so it makes the process slow. Whereas in a place like, say, China, you can just say, well, we're going to go here, here, and here, and we're done whenever we say we're done. And so it partly, there's some trade-offs that come with those two forms, of course. But just to add to the pile of things that go into what's challenging about transportation in a place like America, that's one of them. But it goes back to what you were talking about, Nicole, in my mind, which is street space allocation, how we decide who gets what in the public space. And overwhelmingly, the answer for most of the last century has been private motorists. Private motorists get the space, and we build the space around them. My dad was recently in San Diego, and he told me, God, Adam, there's so many scooters. The scooters are everywhere. I said, Dad, how many cars did you see at the same time? The cars, we assume them to be there. We assume they will always be there. And I don't blame people who see bikes and scooters coming onto the sidewalk. It's dangerous for them to be in the street where the cars are. It's dangerous for anyone to be there. So as we think about how to allocate space and what we dedicate it to, I think that's the opportunity for policy, and it's the opportunity for new tech ideas. But that's where the fight happens. There's a great writer, Peter Norton, that talks about this challenge of the street space and how the private motorists have really won over capturing that space for the last 100 years in America. And it ultimately is a local political fight.
I'm thinking, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of the disruptive technology that Boston pioneered, which was the subway, right? And the reason that the reason they built the subway I'm pretty sure of this, is that the streets in 1896, whatever the year was, it was before cars, right? I mean, there was only 3 cars involved. Is because the horse-drawn trolleys were so congested that you could actually make across the street on top of the trolleys, as opposed to kind of finding your way across the street. So they decided to put it underground. So, I guess my question is to you is Adam, is what disruptive thing is Uber or ride-sharing going to do that we don't know about it yet? What subway
I'm here to announce today it's called Uber Horse. We'll send you the bale of hay.
And quick before
it's
the IPO.
It's a messy product, I gotta say, coming into it.
Well, because what was it? Henry Ford is credited with saying, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Right? What is there anything is there any magic that we're not understanding at this point? I mean, it was so disruptive. Uber's been 10 years? It's less than 10 years old.
We're very new to this, and according to the last Department of Transportation census, which was the first time the survey asked about ride-hailing, ride-sharing, the Department of Transportation in the United States conducts this about every 5 years to get a sense from more than 100,000 households. How do we all move? How do we Americans move throughout the United States? And the answer that they came up with was if you take ride-hailing and you take taxi and limo and you put them all together, it's about 0.5% of all the miles.
Really?
0.5%. And then the motorists are about 92%. And so we're very new. We're very young. If you zoom into a city level, we get to about 1.7% of all the miles traveled in very urban contexts. And when I say we, I mean the entire category of shared mobility, on-demand mobility, including taxi. So it's very small, and we're very new to this. We're just learning about it. But we recognize that the challenges facing getting lots of people to move around in cities have been long-standing, and there's never been not a time where we didn't have these challenges. Back to your point, I remember these old stories when I used to work in the hydrogen and fuel cell world of clean mobility, and back then people used to wax poetic about what happened before the time of the gasoline car. Well, to your point, in Manhattan, there's all these streets and these images of horses littering the streets, and not just living horses, dead horses too. They had to remove the carcasses from the street. It was a total nuisance to the public existence. What are we going to do about this big horse problem? Gasoline came along. What are we going to do about this big problem of gasoline? It's a dangerous substance. All these things over time, they have gone in waves. As we think about it, we think about what can we do to bring new technology to these long-standing challenges, and how can we provide efficiency? And from our view, if we can offer a convenient and affordable and efficient option for getting from A to B, people will do it. Pool is a great example. So when we launched Uber Pool a couple of years ago, is anybody familiar with Uber Pool, or Lyft Line is what they call it at Lyft? This is the idea that you get a cheaper trip, but you got to sit next to a stranger if we match you along the way. And you might have to walk a little bit and wait a little bit longer in exchange for that cheaper price. Using like last year's data, for instance, we had Pool available in about 40 cities, in cities where we had sufficient demand to make it work. And in those cities, people chose Pool 20% of the time. When I got to Uber, I thought, gosh, that's a low number. There should be more. And in some cities like San Francisco and LA, where we've been operating a long time, it's more like 40 or 50% of the time. But still, I compared that to carpooling figures in the United States. And carpool is about 9% of all commute. And so somehow through product innovation, making it easier to share the ride and cheaper, people will do it. And this gets at one of transportation's longstanding challenges is what do you do about the consumer behavior piece? Having worked in EVs for most of my career, especially when I worked at CARB 20 years ago, the line was always, well, most trips are less than 10 miles in America. And these EVs that have, in those days it was like 50 miles of range back 20 years ago. Today we've gotten to like 200 miles of range. That'll serve almost all your trip needs. That never works for consumers. We would get consumers into the EV and say, isn't this cool? And they'd be like, where's the cup holder? You know, we as consumers, we're just, you know, we shouldn't be blamed for our choices, but we make them because we are creatures of habit and of comfort and lots of things. And so trying to attack that, what can we do to change consumer behavior has been a challenge, but we're hopeful that through innovation, we can offer more value and more options that make it easier.
So Bruce, you were kind of asking about the future and what will technology bring and how will it change us. My hope for what Greater Boston looks like in 50 years is actually much closer to what Greater Boston looked like in 1900 than it does today, and especially more like 1900 than it did in any of those videos that we saw about what the future would be like, where people are in hermetically sealed pods that are flying around the city. That's not the city that I want to live in. I want to live in a city that looks like 1900 Boston. And I teach a class at Northeastern. In the very first class session, I play for them a video that I found on YouTube, which someone took an early camera and strapped it to the front of a streetcar and just had it go around the streets of Boston for 20, 25 minutes in the year 1905.
Oh, I've seen that.
And it is a fascinating video. And that is the place where I want to live, because there are people everywhere on the streets interacting with each other, enjoying their day. There's this incredible street life of merchants whose stores are basically spilling into the streets with stands out front. There are families that are walking on the Boston Common. There are families shopping on Washington Street in downtown Crossing. That's the past that we once had in Greater Boston. That is actually our legacy and our urban fabric from 150, 200 years of development. And we sort of went away from that starting around really 1950, kind of post-war. I want to get back to that much more than I want to get to a future of the Hyperloop or the flying pod. And I think we can do that. And I think it would make us all happier and healthier and better off if we could move in that direction. And I think it's much less about technology and much more about the choices that we make as a community and as a democracy.
Nicole, you get the last word, but we have some questions. But I just want to get your response to that.
For a world where we want to see our future?
Well, yes. You're positive. And you are too, for a completely different set of reasons. Nicole?
Well, I think I want to see two things for our future. I still very much want to see Boston and the Metro Boston area be a world-class cycling city. I think we can do it. I think it takes ever more political will, but I know that if we build the infrastructure right, people will bike. And we have exactly the demographic we want. We're a college town, we're relatively flat. We're exactly the demographic that will bike. And number two, as soon as possible, I do want to see the switch to electric vehicles. That's a very short-term goal. I want to see us really drop in half our greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector in the next decade. And I think it can happen. It just takes a lot of work. Right now, we know how to do it. We just have to go for it and do it.
We almost got through a whole conversation about transportation and urban transportation without talking about greenhouse gases, essentially, and climate change. Yeah. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So a bunch of questions.
Hi. Climate change is in the title, and you just mentioned it, Bruce, so thanks for bringing that up. The latest IPCC report makes very difficult reading because we have such little time to decarbonize. So we're only going to do it if we have a plan. Yes. And so I'd like to know, particularly the two of you who have directors in your title of transportation, seems like the right thing to do. Could you talk about the concrete plans that the city has to decarbonize transport?
So some of the initiatives that we are working on in Newton, one is electric vehicles. So we're working with a vendor. We've about to sign a contract, hopefully, with a company called GreenSpot to bring electric vehicle car share, to add 12 charging stations to our city. That's seen as the launch phase, and it's intended to expand. The goal of that is to encourage people to try out electric vehicles, hopefully purchase those when they replace their car. Number two, by having the electric vehicle car share, it enables people to perhaps get rid of that second car, use this when they do need a car. Number 3, it does provide a location for Uber and Lyft drivers to charge their vehicles. So that's a push that we can make locally. We're also looking at electric vehicle preferential parking in the city. Just another little nudge to say, hey, if you get an electric vehicle, that's great. The city is very close to being an all-electric car fleet. So all of the cars owned by the city will be electric very, very shortly. I don't know the exact date of that. Number 2, we're working with a company, Via. Historically, we have been providing transportation for our seniors, 28,000 trips a year provided by taxis, and those are combustion engine cars. We switched to a company, Via, to provide the vehicles. Via is on-demand microtransit, and what we liked about Via is their ability to do shared trips. They have a very, very powerful algorithm. Their business is shared trips, shared transit, microtransit, and we're looking at that as a way to expand throughout the city. So one of the challenges we have in Newton is we have low density. We do have some transit lines, the Green Line, the commuter rail, 2 north-south bus lines, but the problem is the vast majority of people don't live near those transit lines, and they can't access them by foot. So with microtransit Via, we're hoping to look at it as expanding citywide. We would be enabling first mile, last mile connectivity through these shared trips, and also many of those trips that are not going anywhere near one of those transit lines, through a company like Via, we can actually have shared trips to transport those passengers.
Microtransit is short trips, or microtransit is small vehicles?
Microtransit is a little bit like what the company Bridge did, but imagine I'm in one location and I want to get to here, another person is here, they want to get to here, a third person is here, want to get there. In real time, we've all gone on our app to request a ride. It actually can string along a trip, making essentially a route on demand. So it's a dynamic routed system. And it works great in lower density cities where we just don't have quite enough density to have everyone having access to the public transit. So it's essentially a way to create public transit for lower density cities. So we're excited. It is, I say it's a pilot, it's a startup company, it's a very good startup company, but we're really working with them to make it a success.
Okay. We're going to take a bunch of these. You want to take a hit at that? Or we're going to take
let me just quickly say what we're doing. So I run Transportation for Massachusetts, which advocates at the state level for better transportation policies, and we use climate as a really important focus and lens there. I think the single most important policy that is in play right now when it comes to transportation and emissions is this Transportation and Climate Initiative that Bruce mentioned. It's essentially taking the very successful structure we already use in electricity and applying it to transportation. The states that have agreed to participate in this program, or to at least design this program and then hopefully participate in it, represent roughly 25% of the US economy, from Virginia to Maine. So if we can get all of these states to agree to cap emissions from transportation and then ratchet that cap down over time, we will be addressing the single largest source of carbon emissions in the country, representing 40% of the country's economy, the US economy. That will be a really big deal. Then the second piece is about getting more people into transit, walking, biking, and shared trips. And we fundamentally believe that this conversation around congestion pricing and road pricing is an incredibly important, necessary tool to start to nudge people like Bruce's daughter to take the 57 bus instead of taking the Uber and Lyft or her personal vehicle, if that's an option for her too. And so while we very much appreciate that people say, well, wait a minute, you're trying to get me out of my car, that's the only way we are going to address the climate emissions issue, is if we are nudging people to get out of their car and to use another option. And so those are the two pillars that we look at that would broadly impact the state and the region.
Please.
Talked about electrification as a primary objective. We talked about electrification as a primary objective. It relates to climate change and reduction of emissions. And we haven't talked at all about transportation that has to do with moving other things besides people. And a lot of goods and the mail and just goods is transported. It's part of the transportation complex, and so I'd like to hear you talk about that. And with regard to air travel again, which we just spent like 30 seconds on, how does electrification offer improvements?
The Transportation and Climate Initiative would apply to all ground transportation fuels, including freight. And so not only would it essentially encourage freight companies to be more efficient in their operations, it would also actually give them rebates and incentives, just like we do on the Mass Save program, where if you're a factory, you can get upgraded light bulbs or upgraded water heaters in your facility. You could do the same thing if you were a fleet of commercial trucks like FedEx or UPS. You could get rebates to move towards electric. The air transportation question is really important. It's of less importance than the ground transportation question. So ground transportation is about 85% of the emissions from transportation. Air is about 10%. So it's still a big problem, but much smaller. And it's probably going to be solved more at the federal level than at the state level because of the nature of air travel. So much of it is really regulated federally and not by the states. And unfortunately, given who's in the White House, we're probably not going to make a lot of progress on that issue. But it just is another example of why this upcoming presidential election is so important if we're going to make progress in areas like that.
One of the things I'm curious about, you spoke about trucking, in congestion. If you go here on Commonwealth Avenue, and now you go anywhere, San Francisco, you'll see trucks loading and unloading in rush hour. Should that be banned? Could we do anything about those things? I mean, that's what's causing a lot of the congestion, why the trucks, the buses can't go down the street faster, or why I have to swerve to get, because they're in my bike lane.
Well, I'm glad you're swerving to avoid running into those trucks, Bruce. But I'm not a great expert on food and freight, but these are businesses that Uber's involved in. So there is Uber Eats, for instance, and we have Uber Freight, which you might not have heard of. Uber Freight is just what it sounds like. If you have a truckload of stuff and you're shipping it from Boston to Bangor, Maine, I'm just picking a town in the Northeast here, we help connect a driver with the load to make that a more efficient process. And so it's...
What is it called?
Like Uber Freight. It's a very sophisticated name. And with Uber Eats, it's sort of order a meal. And in general, there's a whole new conversation around freight and the movement of things in cities, because more and more of us are ordering from Amazon online, bringing things to our home, or ordering meals in our home, and sort of the dynamics of consumer consumption are changing. And I think there's a lot of new data that needs to be pulled about that sector, and a lot more research to learn from. But one of the things that I'm positive on is the fact that if you look at travel data, a lot of us make these sort of single trips where one leg of the trip is useful and the other leg was not necessarily necessary in a shared mobility world. Let me give you an example. If you've made a decision to eat a Big Mac at home, you're going to get in your car and drive to your nearest McDonald's and then bring the Big Mac home. Well, in a world of food delivery, where you push a button and a Big Mac can come to you, you've effectively eliminated one of those trips if it's used in the same vehicle, or maybe it's a bike courier or something like that. So there's an opportunity to make that a much more efficient system than it is today. It's the same with airport travel. If you go to pick up a loved one at the airport and bring them home, one leg of that trip is productive, meaning if somebody else brought them home and they had taken and dropped somebody off, it's effectively more productive for a taxi or a shared ride to do that than if you went and got them yourselves. And you can spend more time at home hugging and things like that instead of on the airport curb. So there is an opportunity. There's a scenario in which that becomes a much more efficient system than what we have today. I think there's a lot of work to do. And again, it goes back to street space and the way that we've designed the way the streets look. We've not designed or built laws or looked at the way that the incentive framework is shaped to encourage shared use of those assets, or to look at ways in which we can make that a more efficient system.
So it's interesting because we're talking about transportation, but you're a data company. And you've got brand new data about how people use and how they're using it in real time and changing to have food delivery and so on. It's really interesting. Is it proprietary data? That's your... That's proprietary data.
We try to do a lot to work with both regulators and cities to share what we're learning as we see it. It's certainly, in order to make the technology possible, we have to get information about the ways in which people and things are moving from A to B. But you may not be aware of a tool that we make publicly available, which is called Movement. Uber Movement is available to anybody. It's online. And in cities where we operate and are collecting enough data for it to be useful, for instance, we offer travel time data, real travel time data from backward looking, and you can analyze, or city planners or average citizens can look at what happened when one of the MBTA lines was shut down on this given day to travel times going from this zone to that zone. And so what we do is we use the data that we're collecting as a proxy for what's happening on the streets in the real world. We're expanding that to include street segment level speed data in certain cities. And over time, we hope that that becomes a great platform to offer some of what we're learning that's useful for public information.
I want to go through these three questions very quickly. Okay, so is it feasible for the T to operate the MBTA without fares? Okay, so we've talked a little bit about paid for by taxes instead. Good idea, bad idea, feasible, not feasible?
So Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu has proposed this, and she's someone I really admire, and I think she's really changed the conversation with this proposal. I think we have a long way to go to get there. So the fares bring in roughly $700 million a year at the MBTA. And
a fraction of what it costs to run the T.
It's about 40% of what it costs to run the T.
It's amazing, right?
So there's no obvious answer for where that $700 million could come from, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could generate revenue in other ways and essentially eliminate fares.
And that would be a good thing?
Well, I mean, only if you want less air pollution, less congestion, better public health, a more vibrant economy. If you want those things, then yeah, it would be a good thing.
Okay. Anybody want to chip in on that? But in your field, how do you prioritize the concept of transportation equity? Any examples of when you rethought a decision to ensure a more equitable outcome? Is a tough question, but there it is. When you rethought the equity issue, because the equity it's a dynamic question, right? There's lots and lots of moving parts, and they happen in real time to different people.
So bike share, in Boston, we launched the Hubway system, now Blue Bikes, in 2011. We were the 4th city to launch in the US. So we were really pioneers in bike share. And we put a lot of thought into how do we do this equitably. And we knew the history with public transportation, and it wasn't good with equity. And so we said, look, I think we can do better. So we talked a lot about where we put the stations, making sure we're putting them in all neighborhoods, neighborhoods of all incomes. But then there was this real tension because for the Hubway system to work, you need network density of stations. So we couldn't just have stations here and then say, well, we want to make sure we're in every single neighborhood and space them so far out that we compromise the integrity of the system. So we did put a lot of thought into making sure we were expanding into neighborhoods and making that a point without compromising the integrity. And that worked really well. And then we said, okay, well, membership is $85 a year. What can we do so that low-income residents are using the Hubway system? And what was interesting is as we were working on this, more and more cities were coming online, and none of them were able to sell low-income memberships to low-income residents. New York City said, oh, we partnered with housing, public housing, and we sold 100 low-income memberships. And Minneapolis was like, we were struggling to give away, low-cost memberships to low-income residents. But I hired someone that was working pretty much full-time on our subsidized membership program. And we said, okay, well, let's make this $5 a year. And $5 was the cheapest amount that we thought would still give people ownership of the system. And we said, we don't want to make money off people that wouldn't be able to afford this anyway. It's not like we're losing revenue, and we have plenty of capacity in the system to absorb new memberships. So $5, we used the honor system. We gave a free helmet, and we marketed it to everyone we wanted. And instead of having one partner through like public housing, we had, I think at one point I counted out maybe 120 different partners that we're constantly working with. And each one of these partners sold 2, 3, 4, 20 memberships. And what was amazing is I think we got up to about almost 20% of our members were low-income residents. And then from there, we launched something called Prescribe a Bike, where doctors could actually, at the Boston Medical Center, which is a safety net hospital, could actually prescribe $5 memberships to low-income residents that were having health issues. So, I think the answer for us for equity was, one, be committed, and two, it is a lot of effort, and really just commit to it and do it. Mm-hmm. There was no magic to what we did, but a lot of hard work.
Fascinating.
I think one dynamic that we've really struggled with is that as you're improving transit, and this is especially true in a community like Chelsea, which has a new bus service called the Silver Line 3 bus service, there's, as a transportation person first, I'm sort of like, oh, this is great. This is going to be great, wonderful for Chelsea. They're going to have more access to Logan Airport and the Seaport in downtown Boston. And some of the reaction in that community was some real anxiety and fear that this transit improvement would also bring gentrification to the neighborhood, and that it would raise rents, and that the neighborhood would no longer be affordable to people who have lived there. And there's no easy answer to that question, but it is a reminder that transportation and housing are inextricably linked, and we need to be thinking about them in tandem, and not just sort of offering these wonderful transportation solutions without thinking about how they're going to impact other parts of the community.
Right, especially the Green Line extension. The price is
another example.
Through the roofs. Yep. Right. What are a few of the key challenges or downsides of electric vehicles, and how can they be addressed? The key challenges, downsides. Challenge would be.
I can start. One of the biggest challenges is that they're too expensive. They're too expensive for consumers, and quite frankly, I think even myself, a lot of us look at this and say, well, who cares? But automakers don't make money. And the problem with automakers not making money on them is that means they don't get any love or budget from the automaker, and they can't plug them into the automaker machine, which sells tons of cars. We all buy lots of cars, but we just don't buy any EVs. And so automakers need to make money, and consumers need to be able to afford them, are two of the challenges on the price side. And on the infrastructure side is there's just not enough of it. Not only that, but the proposition for building out infrastructure is a very expensive one, especially for governments. And the current way of doing things, since we're imagining a world where all of us will continue to own the car that we drive and barely ever use it, you have to cast a very wide net of infrastructure. And with electric infrastructure, you can put it almost anywhere, which is a good news. But the bad news is that it means it's a poor business proposition to the infrastructure provider. You're going to put one station way out there or in somebody's home or at a business, and it's barely ever going to get used. So we need to solve those challenges of utilization on the infrastructure and of effectively driving down the cost of building out those EVs. We're hopeful that shared mobility technology can play a role in solving some of that challenge. Back to our conversation earlier, it may be cheaper to sell someone an e-trip than an EV. But we've got a long way to go to get there because drivers themselves face a lot of barriers to switching from, say, a Prius today to an EV tomorrow. It's just generally not in their economic best interest, and that's where we need to start the conversation to see how can we address the challenge.
Fabulous.
So Bruce, my concern very quickly is, if we could snap our fingers tomorrow and trade out every single internal combustion engine on the road today and replace it with an electric vehicle, that would be a great thing for society. It would be a great thing for our climate goals. It would do absolutely nothing for our congestion goals and do very little for our quality of life goals. And so it's not just about trading out the cars that are there today and getting EVs. It's about providing people with more options and getting them out of their vehicle to instead walk, bike, take transit, share trips, other things beyond just swapping out the technology that sits under their hood.
I agree 100% with Chris. With that said, given the urgency of the climate issue, I would be thrilled if we swapped out 100% of our cars for electric vehicles. That's our future, and we have to. And we can deal with the congestion in time, we can deal with the quality of life, but we need to get into those EVs right away. Number two, we actually have to figure out where the electricity is coming to power our electric vehicles, but that's still better than the internal combustion engines.
Yeah, in 47 out of 50 states, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're already there, and in something like 27 out of 29 EU member nations. So we're getting very close on the energy side. There's other countries that struggle with that are heavily powered by coal, from China to Australia to Indonesia. But broadly speaking, in the U.S., it's been mostly solved.
You guys are terrific. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
And thanks to the audience. Great conversation.
There's several of you I know who wanted your questions asked, particularly about local issues. And if you guys can hang around a little bit, and feel free to ask your questions to the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Signed into law a bill that supported the building of the Transcontinental. And when it was completed in 1869, it linked